You wouldn't expect something unforgettable to begin on a quiet evening like that. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Just an ordinary moment in my home that slowly unfolded into something far more meaningful than I could have imagined. What began as a simple visit from my daughter's friend became one of those rare experiences that stays with you. Not because it frightened you, but because it stirred something tender and unexpected inside. A reminder of how connection can arrive without warning, and how life, even late in its chapters, still knows how to surprise us. Before we continue, remember to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. It truly helps us more than you know. Now, settle in. That afternoon, I had moved through the living room with quiet intention, straightening picture frames, smoothing the cushions, brushing dust from shelves worn smooth by time. At 80 years old, I've come to understand that these small acts are never really about appearances. They're about care. About creating a space that feels safe and gentle for anyone who crosses your threshold, whether they're family, a friend, or someone you're only just beginning to know. Soft sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting the room in muted gold. The house felt still, almost as if it were holding its breath. Emily had mentioned earlier that her friend Paul might stop by near dinner time. I knew very little about him. Just fragments really. Polite, thoughtful, quiet in a way that suggested depth rather than distance. I didn't give it much more thought than that. Then, just as the clock edged toward 6, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Paul stood there holding a small bundle of wildflowers, their stems uneven, their colors modest but sincere. The simplicity of the gesture caught me off guard, and before I realized it I was smiling. He looked a little unsure of himself. Shoulders slightly tense, but his eyes held a softness that immediately eased something inside me. "Hello, Mrs. Monica," he said, his voice careful but kind. "Emily said it would be all right if I stopped by for a short visit. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," I replied, stepping aside. "Please, come in. You're welcome here." He crossed the threshold with measured steps, as if mindful not to disrupt the quiet balance of the house. For a brief moment, he paused near the staircase, taking everything in, not just the room, but the feeling of it. And in that pause, I sensed that this visit might be more than either of us had anticipated. He stood there for a moment, quietly taking it all in. The framed family photographs lining the wall, the small trinkets gathered over decades, each one holding a story even if no one ever asked for it. I invited him to sit in the living room, and he did, placing the flowers carefully on the coffee table, as though they deserved a moment of respect. At first, our conversation stayed safely on familiar ground. We spoke about the weather drifting toward autumn, Emily's increasingly hectic schedule, the new bookstore opening downtown. Ordinary things, comfortable things, and yet, beneath the casual exchange something else lingered. An unspoken awareness. A shared sense that we were both listening beyond the words themselves. Paul had a way of being fully present, quiet, attentive, unhurried. It made even the simplest topics feel meaningful. I noticed myself leaning in just slightly, drawn to the calm sincerity in his voice and the understated humor that surfaced when I least expected it. Without any clear moment of transition, the conversation gently shifted. I began speaking about my younger years, how I'd traveled when I was about Emily's age, the modest adventures that once felt so big, and how they slowly shaped the person I became. Memories I hadn't revisited in years rose effortlessly to the surface. Paul listened with genuine focus, nodding now and then, asking thoughtful questions that surprised me. The kind that didn't just acknowledge what I'd said, but invited me to look at those memories from a new angle. As the afternoon light softened around us, something changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was subtle, like a fine thread being quietly woven between two people without either of them noticing at first. His attention didn't feel polite or obligatory. It felt real. And in that realization, I understood that I wasn't speaking just to fill the silence. I was being heard. Truly heard, and that feeling was rare. Precious. Eventually, I offered him a cup of tea. He accepted with a small, grateful smile. The kettle began to whistle, its gentle sound filling the room, followed by the warm, familiar scent of chamomile. We sat together on the sofa, sipping slowly, letting the conversation move naturally, through pauses, shared glances and silences that weren't empty at all, but quietly full of understanding. At one point, his gaze lingered on a photograph near the window. Emily as a little girl, perched on my lap, her smile wide and unrestrained, the kind that only exists before the world teaches restraint. He studied it for a moment before speaking. "She's very lucky to have you," he said. The words were simple, almost understated. Yet they settled into me with unexpected weight. A warmth spread through my chest, tender and ache fill all at once. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition. An acknowledgement of years spent loving quietly, of sacrifices no one applauds, of joy folded into exhaustion, of tears shed where no one could see them. As the evening deepened, the ordinary details of the night began to feel almost cinematic. The cups cooling on the table. The soft cadence of our conversation. The fading light outside the windows, stretching shadows across the walls. The house felt different, alive not with movement or noise, but with stillness. With presence. With something forming gently between two people who had no expectations yet found themselves unexpectedly open. When Paul finally rose to leave, I noticed a faint sense of reluctance within myself. A softness I hadn't anticipated. It surprised me how quickly the moment had rooted itself. I thanked him for coming, and he offered that quiet, unassuming smile. One that carried a depth words never quite managed to reach. "Thank you for letting me visit, Mrs. Monica," he said. I didn't expect it to feel like this. It's been really special." I nodded, because I understood. Some moments resist explanation. They don't ask to be analyzed or defined. They simply exist quiet, meaningful, occupying that fragile space between people who, even briefly, truly see one another. When I closed the door behind him, the house returned to its silence, but something within me had shifted. The evening had left its mark. It hadn't just been a visit from my daughter's friend. It was a reminder of connection, of trust, and of the unexpected beauty that can emerge when we allow ourselves to remain open. Even when we ache, life has already shown us all its surprises. The days that followed drifted by in a gentle, almost dreamlike rhythm. At my age, life tends to move predictably, meals at familiar hours, a slow walk through the neighborhood, the morning paper spread neatly across the table, and keeping pace with Emily's ever-busy world. Routine has a way of settling in quietly. Yet after Paul's visit, something subtle had changed. There was a quiet expectancy woven into my days now. Like a soft undercurrent beneath the surface of ordinary time. I noticed myself glancing at the clock more often than usual, half aware of what I was waiting for. Even the most familiar routines felt faintly illuminated by the memory of that evening, as though it had left behind a gentle afterglow. The next morning, a message arrived from Paul. Just a few lines, warm, thoughtful, thanking me again for welcoming him into my home. There was nothing improper in it. Nothing that crossed a line, only sincerity. The kind that arrives without agenda. It made me smile in a way that surprised me, in a way I hadn't felt in years. I replied, expecting the exchange to end there. Instead, it unfolded. Casual messages slowly grew longer. We spoke about books we love, shared small fragments of our lives, laughed at the quiet absurdities that fill everyday moments. Each message felt like another thread, light and unassuming, gently stitching a connection neither of us had gone looking for. On the third day, Paul asked if he might stop by again. I paused before responding, surprised by my own hesitation. Part of it was the awareness that this was unusual, unexpected at this stage of life. Another part was the unfamiliar flutter of anticipation I hadn't quite learned how to name. Still, there was no real reason to resist something that felt so sincere, so grounding, so quietly uplifting. When he arrived that afternoon, the sunlight had mellowed into a warm, golden glow, the kind that softens edges and pulls memories closer. Everything seemed touched by nostalgia. As if the moment itself understood it was becoming something worth remembering. Paul arrived without flowers this time, without any offering at all. Just that steady calm and a reserved smile that felt familiar now. We settled once more into the living room, the ritual of tea unfolding naturally between us. Steam rising softly from the cups. There was comfort in returning to the same space, the same chairs, yet beneath it nivered something newly charged. Not unease, but attention, a growing awareness. We both seemed to understand that whatever was forming between us was unusual, and neither of us wished to disturb it by moving too quickly. We talked for what must have been hours, though time seemed to loosen its hold on us. I spoke of my travels, of Emily as a child, her stubbornness, her laughter, of the small victories and quiet disappointments that shape a life over decades. Paul listened with a depth that felt rare. I watched his expressions shift almost imperceptibly, a lift of the eyebrows at something unexpected, a soft laugh at an absurd memory, a thoughtful stillness when my words gave him pause. In those moments, I felt unmistakably seen. In a way I hadn't realized I had been missing. When he mentioned a novel he'd been rereading, the conversation took another gentle turn. We discovered a shared love for the same authors, the same kinds of stories, ones that linger rather than shout. There was an unexpected intimacy in that recognition, in realizing we approached the world with similar curiosity and care. His eyes softened as he spoke, and I noticed the way he leaned slightly forward, attentive but never intrusive, as if drawn closer by understanding rather than intention. I felt lighter than I had in months. Not careless or ungrounded, but buoyed by something delicate and new. Alongside it stirred an unfamiliar emotion, thrilling in its subtlety, asking to be noticed without demanding to be named. As the afternoon light began to wane, stretching longer shadows across the floor, Paul glanced toward the window and suggested we take a walk. I hesitated at first, surprised by the pause that rose within me. It wasn't something I typically did, setting out alone with someone I barely knew. But there was a steadiness about Paul, a quiet reassurance that made agreeing feel almost instinctive. We moved at an unhurried pace down the lane, leaves whispering beneath our steps, the world softened by the glow of the setting sun. For a while, we walked without speaking. The silence didn't feel awkward or empty. It felt intentional, as though sharing the moment itself was enough. I became aware of small, almost imperceptible details, the brief brush of his hand against mine as we adjusted our steps, the way he seemed to sense when my thoughts drifted inward. A warmth spread through me, layered and unexpected, made up of surprise, gentle joy, and a quiet sense of recognition. None of it was planned, and yet it felt entirely right. In that moment, I understood that what was growing between us reached beyond simple companionship. It was respect. A shared acknowledgement of the lives we had lived, the experiences we carried with us, and a soft curiosity about what still remained to be discovered. We stopped at a small wooden bridge overlooking the stream that wound its way through the neighborhood. The water caught the fading light, scattering it into bright fragments that shimmered like tiny stars. I felt a sudden, overwhelming gratitude for the simplicity of being there, present, unguarded, alive to the moment. Paul spoke quietly then, remarking on how rare it was to meet someone who made conversation feel both easy and meaningful at once. I nodded, my heart lifting as I sensed that this evening was shaping itself into something I would carry with me long after it ended. When we returned to the house, neither of us spoke about the subtle charge that lingered from the walk. We didn't need to. It remained in the air between us, unspoken, unmistakable, and gently alive. We shared a quiet dinner that evening, savoring simple flavors and the ease of one another's company. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic revelations. None were needed. The connection lived in the smallest details, the way our eyes met across the table, the soft laughter that rose without effort, the reassurance found in moments of shared silence. Everything felt unhurried, intentional, real. When Paul eventually left, I realized how deeply I had begun to anticipate these moments. They had become gentle markers in my days, reminders that life, even in its later chapters, still holds room for warmth, surprise, and connection. As I watched him walk slowly down the lane, his figure fading into the twilight, a quiet gratitude settled over me. Gratitude for companionship in its purest form, for the rare comfort of being truly seen, for the delicate stirrings of something that felt as though it might grow into a memory I would carry for a long time. The days that followed arranged themselves into a rhythm I hadn't expected. Each visit layered something quietly extraordinary over the familiar patterns of daily life. Nothing about it felt sudden or dramatic. It was subtle, small moments accumulating gently until their weight became undeniable. I caught myself smiling without realizing why. At the memory of our walks. At the sound of his voice echoed in my thoughts after our messages. At the care he took in listening, in responding, in simply being present. Something was awakening inside me, a reminder that life does not stop offering its quiet surprises, no matter how many years have passed. One evening, Paul arrived just as the sky deepened into a rich amber hue, the kind of light that seems to hold the world in suspension before night fully settles in. This time, he carried a small notebook. I noticed how his fingers lingered on its edges, fidgeting slightly, as though he were uncertain how, or when, to introduce what it held. And in that small hesitation, I sensed that something was about to change. Introduce what he had brought. I thought you might like to see this, he said, finally, holding the notebook out toward me. I accepted it carefully, as though it were something fragile. Inside, the pages were filled with sketches, clean lines unassuming at first glance, yet remarkably expressive. He had drawn familiar scenes. The street corner just beyond my home. The old tree near the lane where we often walked. A cat curled lazily in a patch of sunlight on a windowsill. Ordinary things, rendered with extraordinary care. Each drawing carried a quiet attentiveness, a patience that suggested time spent simply observing. Seeing. Not rushing past. They're beautiful, I said softly, surprised by how moved I felt. Paul gave a small shrug, modest as ever. Though I caught the faint glimmer of pride in his eyes. I like capturing small moments, he said. Things people might overlook. They seem ordinary. But they feel important when you really stop and look. As he spoke, something settled into place for me. His presence in my life had been much the same. Made up of small gestures, thoughtful pauses, the rare ability to find meaning in the everyday. And perhaps I realized with a mix of excitement and unease. He had been noticing me with that same care. The thought sent a quiet thrill through me. Unnerving and exhilarating all at once. We spent the rest of the evening in a gentle, companionable stillness. Tea cooled between us as we turned to pages, sometimes speaking. Sometimes simply letting the silence hold. Outside, the light shifted slowly, shadows stretching across the walls and furniture, marking time without urgency. I became increasingly aware of my own responses. The way I leaned forward when he spoke. How my gaze lingered on his expressions. The soft pulse of anticipation that stirred in my chest whenever he offered even the smallest sign of attentiveness. At one point, my fingers paused over a sketch of the tree near the lane. I held it a moment longer than the others. This one, I said quietly, it reminds me of our walks. And as our eyes met, I sensed that the moment carried more meaning than either of us had yet put into words. Paul smiled then, a quiet, knowing smile. As though he understood exactly what that sketch meant to me. I thought you might. He said gently. It's my favorite too. It was in moments like that I felt most awake. Not because anything dramatic was happening. But because the connection between us was unmistakable without ever being named. There was trust in the pauses. Respect in the way we listened. And beneath it all, a delicate tension, a soft current of energy that needed no words to be real. Later, as we returned to the living room, I suggested we listen to some music. I placed a record on the old turntable, and soon the room filled with warm, familiar melodies, slightly imperfect in the way only vinyl can be. The sound wrapped around us, settling into the corners of the house like something remembered rather than heard for the first time. Paul seemed to ease further into himself, letting the music and the comfort of my home carry the moment. I noticed the way he looked at me from time to time, not with expectation or urgency, but with a gentle curiosity, a warmth that caused a quiet flutter in my chest. Our conversation drifted into places we rarely allow ourselves to revisit. Dreams we had set aside long ago. Hopes carefully folded away with time. He spoke of his family, of challenges that had tested him, of small, hard-won victories that shaped who he had become. I shared my own stories in return, surprised by how easily they surfaced. In him, I found a rare kind of receptivity, a steady, unguarded empathy that made me feel understood in ways I hadn't anticipated. As the evening stretched on, it became clear just how deeply this connection had reached me. It wasn't romance in the usual sense. It was quieter, deeper. Something that moved beneath the surface. It was built on mutual respect, emotional honesty, and the subtle thrill of being truly seen. Even in the smallest gestures. When Paul finally rose to leave, the space between us felt charged with everything we hadn't said, but both recognized. I walked him to the door, and for a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, night had fully settled in, wrapping the world in stillness, as though it, too, was holding its breath. The first stars beginning to surface faintly in the darkening sky. "Thank you," he said at last, his voice low and sincere, "for letting me be part of this. Even if it was only for a few hours." I nodded, a tightness rising in my throat. "No," I replied quietly. "Thank you, Paul. I didn't know life could still feel like this." We lingered there a moment longer, the kind of pause that stretches time, carrying more meaning than words ever could. Then, slowly, he turned and walked down the lane, his figure dissolving into the soft darkness, leaving behind a sense of wonder and anticipation I hadn't felt in decades. When I closed the door and rested my weight against it, I let the evening settle into me. Life, even at 80, still had the power to surprise. What had begun as an ordinary night had quietly transformed. Not through grand gestures or bold declarations, but through attentiveness, connection, and the courage to open oneself to another. Somewhere deep within me, I knew the next visit, the next conversation, might lead us somewhere neither of us had dared to imagine. Though both of us silently hoped it would. That next visit came on a cool, crisp evening, the air scented faintly with fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. I had prepared the house with the same careful attention as always, but my heart was more alert this time, aware of the anticipation, of the subtle thrill that accompanied Paul's presence now. There was something different about him when he arrived. A quiet energy. A calm confidence softened by the same warmth I had grown to cherish. He carried a small package, not flowers, not sketches, but a book. "I remembered you mentioning it the other day," he said as he handed it to me. His eyes held that familiar, gentle attentiveness. The kind that makes you feel noticed in ways you didn't realize you had been missing. We settled once again into the living room, tea warming our hands as the last light of day stretched long shadows across the floor. The house felt alive in a new way tonight. Its ordinary objects infused with memory, the sketches, the silence, the moments we had already shared, quietly reminding me that something meaningful was continuing to unfold. The photographs, the familiar corners of the room, the gentle echoes of conversations that now felt layered with meaning. There was a rhythm to our being together. A careful balance of ease, curiosity, and quiet excitement that made the evening feel as though it existed outside of time. As we talked, I found myself reaching back into memories I had kept carefully folded away for decades. Stories of love and loss, of small triumphs that once felt enormous, of moments that had shaped me in ways I rarely spoke about anymore. Paul listened with an attentiveness that went far beyond politeness. He was fully present, undistracted, and in that presence I felt a warmth spread through me, slowly, steadily, insistently. This wasn't romance in any dramatic or familiar sense. It was something subtler, more grounding. Recognition, understanding, the extraordinary feeling of being truly seen, not for who you once were, but for who you still are. At one point, Paul reached across the table. There was no urgency in the gesture, no expectation attached to it. Just a quiet instinct for connection. His fingers brushed my hand, briefly at first, then resting there for a heartbeat longer. The warmth of it sent a gentle ripple through me. I didn't pull away. I allowed the moment to exist, letting myself feel the simple, human closeness that had grown between us over these past weeks. We laughed together, sometimes softly, sometimes with unexpected heartiness, at memories, at observations, at the strange quirks of life neither of us could have anticipated. The air between us felt charged, not with tension, but with recognition, an understanding that we had found something rare in one another. Something mutual. Something freely given. A connection shaped by trust, attentiveness, and the quiet courage to be vulnerable. Later, we moved to the living room sofa, where the light softened and the shadows stretched long across the room. I became aware of how Paul's presence seemed to lift something inside me, how I felt lighter in spirit, younger somehow. As though decades of routine had gently loosened their grip for these few hours. There was no rushing between us. No sense of urgency or expectation. Only the natural unfolding of conversation, shared reflections, and comfortable pauses. At one point, I spoke about a decision I had postponed for years. A personal project I once dreamed of pursuing but quietly set aside out of fear. Paul listened without interruption, offering encouragement with a gentleness that never felt directive or judgmental. His words didn't push, they steadied. In his presence, I realized I had rediscovered a part of myself I thought had long faded, a part that could still be curious, still brave, still alive to possibility. As the evening deepened into night, I walked him to the door. Outside, the sky was clear, the stars beginning to emerge one by one. Each a quiet reminder of how vast life can still be, even when we think we've already seen its shape. Paul met my gaze with that familiar warmth. Sincerity settling between us like something earned. I felt a quiet contentment take root, deep and steady. "Thank you, Monica," he said softly. "These evenings, these moments, they mean more than I can really say." I smiled, a sense of peace washing over me. "Paul, thank you," I replied. "You've reminded me that connection doesn't come with an expiration date." We lingered there a moment longer. A silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between us. It was built not on urgency or illusion, but on mutual respect, understanding, and the gradual unfolding of emotions that had taken us both by surprise. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away, leaving me with a sense of gratitude and quiet wonder that I knew would linger long after the night had faded. When I closed the door and rested against it, I let myself reflect on the weeks that had brought us here. What had begun as a simple visit from my daughter's friend had transformed ordinary evenings into something quietly extraordinary. Not through grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but through attentiveness, empathy, and the courage to remain open, even in life's later chapters. Back in the living room, I took in the familiar surroundings, the photographs, the soft lamplight, the sketches Paul had shared, and felt a deep, steady sense of fulfillment settle within me. Life, even at 80, still held surprises. It still offered moments worth cherishing and opportunities for discovery. And in that discovery, I had found more than companionship. I had found a reminder that the heart does not age out of warmth, or joy, or the ability to recognize something meaningful when it arrives unexpectedly. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I smiled to myself, carrying the memory of the evening, the touch, the laughter, the conversations, safely with me. Some nights pass without leaving a trace. Others, if you're fortunate, become unforgettable. And I knew without question that this was one of them.